Today's class, we're going to discuss the swing era, uh, the staple really of popular musical culture in the United States from the 30s through a good deal of the 40s. And we'll talk about the beginnings of that and the ending of that and why it all came to an end. The swing era is perhaps the last time that the country was really obsessed with a style of music that had a large instrumental component. We saw that the same was true of ragtime, but of course, ragtime also had a substantial song production, right? In fact, most of the famous ragtime tunes were songs, and the same is true of the swing era. When we're looking back at the way the songs that were the most popular, some of them were dance songs that were instrumental. Some of the Benny Goodman songs, "Sing Sing Sing" with a little swing, and songs of those ilk, of that ilk. But there were also plenty of actual songs with words, "Pennies from Heaven" and so on, that were also big hits. So it's very similar to ragtime in that sense. There was a very substantial instrumental component, either entire songs that were instrumental tunes that were meant for dancing and for listening, or songs that had large instrumental parts within a song that also had sung moments. And we'll talk about how that works as we go along. But really, after the swing era, there really wasn't any other music that caught that much of the national attention that was based around instrumental performance. You've had, obviously, the marching bands that we've talked about before. You've had ragtime and various other instrumental genres and dance genres. But this is sort of the peak of that in a lot of ways in the 30s and 40s. Now, one of the things that might seem counterintuitive is why on earth would it be during the Depression that we have the swing era? Because the swing era, after all, goes from roughly 1932 or so. It depends on exactly how you're counting it. You might think of certain elements of the late 20s as leading into it. That's fine. You get the idea. It was basically from the 30s through the early 40s, and it kind of dies out with World War II, but also with the AFM recording band, which we'll talk about in an upcoming session. So, in other words, it basically is the soundtrack for the Depression, along with the country brother duos and things that we were talking about in another session. But the mainstream of musical production during the Depression was surrounding these swing era bands. These are large groups, and so we're going to want to ask ourselves today how it is that they could just financially maintain these large groups in an era of economic downturn. Now, let's back up a bit and talk about the term, right? The term swing appears in relation to music in the late 1920s and early 1930s. For instance, there's Duke Ellington's "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing." That's from 1932. Around 1935, the music industry begins to use that term as a reference for a musical genre, right? And so a way in which this new music of the mid 30s through the mid to late 40s, that this new music is distinct from earlier forms of jazz, which were already being thought of as somewhat passe, as somewhat antiquated. So we talked about the stock market crash in 1929. We didn't mention that 1933, another thing that Roosevelt brings about is the repeal of prohibition, right? Prohibition it's one of those moments in U.S. history that's well worth investigating, because it has several ramifications, but it wound up being a fairly unpopular law for a number of reasons. It was brought into being in part because of this idea of moral uplift in the U.S. It was also very important as part of the women's right to vote movement. That was a large part of it, was trying to show that women had an impact on the political scene, on the national agenda. But the enforcement of it was incredibly clumsy, and it led to a great deal of mob activity, a great deal of violence, and a great deal of just basic hypocrisy and incompetence and corruption. So it was repealed in 1933. And then, of course, you have the New Deal economic programs from 33 to 36. And these were ways in which Roosevelt was trying to get the country working again. So there were all sorts of these programs, including some set aside specifically for artists. So, for instance, Hayden Palmer or Jacob Lawrence, they were artists who were paid to be artists by the government. And so Jacob Lawrence would have to come to an office and show that he was still working, show paintings, give clips for any showings he might have had. And as long as he did all those things, then he got a check. So he was basically being paid to be an artist, but not by selling his works, because there was a much more limited audience, obviously, for buying fine art. So you have a huge decline, obviously, in the record industry and in live concert going public, but you have a huge uptick in listening to the radio. The talent agency MCA, the Music Corporation of America, was founded in 1924, and what they do, they're the important linchpin here, because live concert going has declined, but they're finding ways to make touring bands profitable, and part of the way they do that is by kind of reinvigorating the old Toba circuit, of coming up with these circuits for tours, but they also streamline things in various ways, as we'll see. Your Hit Parade, sponsored by Lucky Strike cigarettes, starts in 1935, and then you also have Make Believe Ballroom, which was sponsored by a diet pill called Retardo in 1935, and they had the original DJ, Martin Block, and he came up with the idea of spinning records on the air instead of having live bands, in part because the technology gotten better so that there was some decent fidelity, but in part because of the Lindbergh trials. Nobody wanted to miss any updates from the Lindbergh trials, and they didn't want to have to interrupt the band that was live in the studio. So if he's playing a record and the latest update from the trial comes in, he can just take the record, lift the needle, and say, we now interrupt this music in order to tell you such and such about the Lindbergh trial. So that had a huge impact on entertainment, as sad as that might be. So what are some of the sources for swing? You have Louis Armstrong. Remember his manager is Joe Glazer, and he really pushed him into having a big band that was a very well-rehearsed but not terribly innovative band, right? It was really just to make him shine. So it was these really talented but still not first string musicians backing him up. And we talked about and looked at the movie Rhapsody in Black and Blue from 32. There's Duke Ellington, and we talked about him at the Cotton Club and his jungle music, and the film Black and Tan Fantasy, 1929. And then you have things like Fletcher Henderson, who we'll talk about now in just a bit, wrapping it up in 1932. That was a major influence on the beginning of swing. And John Hammond comes back, the A&R man from Columbia Records, and he invests basically in the new King Porter Stomp by Fletcher Henderson, and he's interested in promoting Henderson, and this is in 1932 as well. And it was Henderson's orchestration style, along with Don Redman, who was also part of Henderson's group, that really created the swing era sound. So if you're reduced to the situation of I don't know why this would happen, but someone saying, tell me the one thing that's central to the rise of swing era music, it would have to be Fletcher Henderson in that orchestration style. And then John Hammond is important in making that proliferate and promulgating this sound and promoting it. Then you have some of the white orchestras, which we'll talk about in greater detail in a moment. The Casa Loma Orchestra is a good example. 1930, they have the Casa Loma Stomp, and that was very influential, especially on other white bands, but also on some bands like Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson was aware of this recording. It's a very smooth sound. You can hear it's not about individuals all the time, but it's about grouping members of the group together to get the various combinations. It's really thinking about an orchestral or orchestrational style. Then finally, of course, you have the Kansas City Territory bands, including Count Basie, who releases 1 O'Clock Jump in 1937, and that's quite a bit later than these other things we're talking about. But it also has a huge impact on the way that the swing era kind of matures. And we'll talk about him as well in just a bit. So the swing orchestra, you tend to have 3 to 4 trumpets, at least in the beginning, before they get huge. You have 3 to 4 trumpets, 2 to 3 trombones, 2 alto saxophones, 1 tenor, 1 baritone. Usually some or all of these saxophonists would double on clarinet. Sometimes, like in the Benny Goodman Band, and that's what you're seeing here, is the Benny Goodman Band, and that's Benny Goodman standing up. And he, of course, is a clarinet virtuoso and a clarinet soloist, so he would be a separate clarinet player. Then you have a rhythm section, and they're usually in the back, and you can see the stand-up bass player. He's just where it's starting to fade out. Behind him is the pianist, and you can see the drummer and the guitarist, right? So that's your basic rhythm section of those four people, and then you have the frontline instruments. Now that's quite a bit bigger than the jazz combos we've been talking about so far, right? I mean, the most we've seen so far, really, other than the beginnings of the Louis Armstrong Orchestra, which we were talking about from the very early 30s. The biggest we've seen before that was the the Hot Seven band, and so on. So these groups, starting with Fletcher Henderson and similar groups, they're expanding the tonal palette that's available to jazz composers, and that's available for these dance orchestras. The reason that these bands were able to maintain some kind of income in the middle of the Depression is because they were really pitched as dance orchestras. And so they would go to these large dance halls where you pay a certain amount of money. Sometimes there were dance contests that would draw in crowds. And so it wasn't a matter of just a few people coming and sitting and listening to music. You were filling dance halls. And so even if you didn't have the ticket price all that high, you were able to recoup the money by filling the hall, and a lot of young people would want to come in to these dances, and so that was one of the ways in which they made the band profitable. And then you also made sure that you followed the touring season properly. Billboard magazine, for instance, ran several articles at the time telling you how you should manage your band if you're going to have a successful swing band. That you have to make sure that you put your band together at the right moment, because the bookings for summer gigs usually start before you would be at the summer gigs, and those are the most lucrative when you get into a hotel for the summer or whatever, right? So you have to have a band that's up and running and sounds good by no later than spring, right? And that means that you've got to back it up. So Billboard had it down to a science. They said the best time to start a band was in November, right? And that would allow you to hit the season just right, and so on, and find these long-term gigs. So what are some of the musical characteristics of swing? We have an emphasis on call and response technique. We've already seen that in the blues, and now we're seeing it in this larger group format. You have also a call and response within the larger group. So Henderson had 13 members of his band, right? So that's almost double what Louis Armstrong had. So it's a larger group, and the call and response could work on different levels. It could be between two soloists, or it could be between two parts of the group. So a lot of times you'll have, for instance, Fletcher Henderson, and we'll see this in a moment, one of the things he liked to do is have a 3 clarinet group. So 3 clarinetists versus the trumpets, and they would go back and forth, call and response. You have solo sections and soli sections. The solo section is obvious. It's a solo player. Soli means that all those instruments, like the 3 clarinets, are playing together, and they have a solo passage, but it's not really solo because they're all 3 playing together, right? But it's a single timbre. And then interesting orchestration effects like the 3 clarinets in Henderson. Carefully arranged backgrounds for solos. So one of the things that Henderson really excelled at as well was that the background was interesting throughout. So while the trumpeter, let's say, is taking his solo, behind that will be, I don't know, a saxophone, a clarinet, and the piano, along with the bass and drums. And they're playing something maybe riff-based or something more interesting than just hitting chords behind everything. You have a more continuous and flowing rhythmic feel, and that's what's meant by the term swing. Swing isn't just a dotted eighth note feel, the way that we often describe to our students when we're first teaching them these kinds of things. So it's a more continuous and even feel. So early jazz has such a pounding hit on one that it overwhelms everything else. Whereas now you have a 4 on the floor approach to the bass drum, where all 4 beats get a bass drum hit, and that evens it out a bit. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. You have the walking bass, which also evens out. Remember that the bass in early jazz was like ragtime bass. So you had a hit on beat 1 and a hit on beat 3. And that gives it that boom, 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 boom kind of feel, right? And it's a little stodgier. It's less even. It doesn't feel as loose, and really the rhythm should approximate the swing. And the swing of the dancing was very close to the floor, keeping your knees bent. That loose feel, and that's what the walking bass is doing as well, where it's playing through notes, walking through the scale to connect one chord to the next. And the two important bassists here are Walter Page in the Territory bands, and then Jimmy Blanton in the Ellington Orchestra. And this creates an emphasis on 4/4 meter rather than the implicit 2/4 of earlier jazz. Then you have the bass drumming that I mentioned, a 4 on the floor with the ride cymbal, and so you have accents on 2 and 4, the backbeat. But in general, the drumming style is lighter, although as we'll see, there are exceptions. And you have the use of the recently invented hi-hat. So you can have closed hi-hat on beats 2 and 4, and then an open hi-hat on 1 and 2. And that gives it a very distinct sound of that kind of thing. So Fletcher Henderson and Don Redman and their arranging style. By 1923, which is quite early, obviously. So this is, before Ellington has his gig at the Cotton Club. You have the Henderson Band, and they are using Redman's arrangements. Featuring the following characteristics. You have the innovative timbral combinations, like Jelly Roll Morton did before him. And here you can listen to Copenhagen. That's a great example with the prominent use of the clarinet trio. And listen to at least the opening of Copenhagen for that. You have the ensemble passages in the style of a solo passage. That's the soli section. So the 3 clarinets playing in close harmony and playing very tightly together rhythmically. That's an important part of the sound. Interactions between different groups of instruments. So the call and response stuff we were talking about a bit ago. The backgrounds are written out to support the sometimes improvised solos so that you have more uniformity and more variety and just catchier things going on. And then he also sets up the modulations so that they build to a climax. This is something he's obviously learning or really going further with than we saw in ragtime music. In 1924, for a brief period of time, Louis Armstrong's in the Henderson Band. So you can see Henderson sitting right behind the bass drum there. And then if you go over to your left, not the person all the way to the left, but the person sitting up above him, that's Louis Armstrong, right? So he joins the band and he creates more of an emphasis on solos. The other members are really inspired to become more definitive solos. And so Coleman Hawkins, for instance, is the sax player at the time. And Benny Carter is also playing sax and trumpet. Buster Bailey's on clarinet. And they're all very influenced by Louis Armstrong. In fact, one of the things that's very typical in jazz, and still goes on today, is you have things, you have various jazz magazines, and sometimes they will have listening polls or listening interviews, and they'll interview somebody and have them listen with them. Downbeat Magazine does this all the time, and talk about the recordings and their thoughts about the recordings or something about the history. And Coleman Hawkins did several of these, and they played some of the recordings that he did before he met Louis Armstrong. He said, "Oh, that's not me, that's my dad," right? It was so old and stodgy sounding as far as he was concerned that he said it was his dad and not him, that he felt that his true style came into being after he was influenced by Louis Armstrong. Now, they played at the Roseland Ballroom, which was a very, very competitive place, and they were very influential while they were playing there. It was competitive because everyone wanted that gig, and they would sometimes have cutting sessions where 2 bands would be hired for one night to compete, and they would vie for audience applause, and whoever won would get the gig for a while, and then they'd have another cutting session some other time. Armstrong was really only with them for a year, but he left quite an impact. And Henderson always said that he felt that it went both ways, that Louis Armstrong learned a lot from being in that band, especially about orchestration. Copenhagen, which I mentioned before, was recorded in 1924 by the Wolverines, including Bix Beiderbecke, and then later in 24 by Henderson, featuring a solo by Armstrong and then the clarinet trio. So listen carefully to that recording, and if you feel like going back and listening to the Wolverines as well, you can hear some really fine playing by Bix Beiderbecke. But it's really by the time we get into the 30s that swing is taking shape in a strong way, right? Henderson really is a pioneer. He's already starting to sound like we think of swing in the late 20s, and certain elements of Ellington sound like that already as well, especially in the very end of the 20s. But it's really in the 30s that the rhythmic innovation of swing comes into focus. And one of the songs that I think makes everything beautifully clear is the Henderson composition Wrapping It Up from 1934. So you've got the call and response. You got this use of hits, right? So that certain beats, sometimes surprising ones, are emphasized to call attention to the rhythm. You've got this intense back and forth of the opening strain. The solos have a great contrasting quality to them. There's no way to mix up one solo with the other. They are these moments that stand out from the overall orchestration. So you have Hilton Jefferson's alto sax solo, which is smooth and fascinating, and then Red Allen's trumpet solo includes a bunch of bold interactions with the rest of the group. And pay attention to the way that his repeated note opening evolves out of the orchestral statement. So even though it's a solo statement, he's clearly responding to the things that just happened. And then the rising orchestral line reveals another strain of his solo, sort of opens up into another strain of his solo. So there's a orchestrational interaction between the soloist and the group behind him. It's not just you play some chords and I do whatever I want over it. It really is a dialogue that's emerging here. And then Buster Bailey's clarinet solo comes out of an orchestral section featuring the 3 clarinet texture that Redman really admired and enjoyed using. So each of these solos, they're these little works of art within this really amazing piece of music. It's one of the great compositions of the mid-30s. Now, you also have the territory bands. And these were bands in the Southwest U.S. who divided up territories. They had, just like a gunslinger might have territories, right? They have territories where they're working. And those bars, now, granted, there were multiple groups within a territory, but those bands occupied that territory. And if some band from another territory came in, they would have a cutting session. They would have a competition to see who gets to keep the gigs and so on. So this is a very competitive part of the country surrounding Kansas City. Missouri, right? Not Kansas City, Kansas, but Kansas City, Missouri. So there were several popular local bands, and they didn't really record much yet early on. Most of our access to this period of history derives from secondhand accounts. We don't know what it all sounded like because very little of it got recorded until later in the 30s. We saw that, one of the early important Count Basie recordings isn't until 1937, but he was working long before that. Kansas City, Missouri is really the center of this. That's where all the greatest the gigs were. It's also where some of the most, vicious, if you wish, cutting contests occurred. It was a very competitive town for music. And part of this was because of the guy that you see pictured there toward the foreground. That's Tom Pendergast. And he really was the political boss of Kansas City from 1928 to 1939. It's partly because of him that Harry Truman, rose to prominence the way that he did and wound up being vice president and then eventually president. There were a lot of important political figures that get their start through Pendergast. Now, Pendergast is an interesting fellow. He's clearly somewhat corrupt. He totally ignores the Volstead Act, the prohibition. He just ignores it. So basically, for all intents and purposes, alcohol is perfectly legal in Kansas City, Missouri. He never had the police shut any of it down and refused federal orders to do so. He was strong enough, powerful enough to just ignore it. So there were very lively nightclubs. It was a very open town in that sense. And this is where many of the luminaries of jazz came to prominence, in part because it was so competitive. So this is where Lester Young came from, Count Basie, Charlie Christian, the great guitarist, and then, of course, Charlie Parker a little bit later, one of the fathers, if you will, of bebop, right, or the founders of bebop. This music is a little different from the New York-based swing music that we were talking about before. Here you have a much heavier reliance on the blues as a universal background. And you can understand why that would be. A lot of these songs are going to be blues songs. And the obvious reason for that is if you're having a lot of competitions, you have to have a certain vocabulary that's in common. Well, everyone knows how to play the 12 bar blues and the various variants on the 12 bar blues. And so it was and also the 12 bar blues is not as stiff as it might sound to people who don't play it. Any of you who actually play the blues know it's a very flexible form. It allows you to do all sorts of things with it, which is why it's a good sort of experimenting ground, if you will. It's a good laboratory to try out your different improvisational techniques and soloing techniques. And so it was used for these cutting sessions because everyone would know the blues, and there were a handful of other songs that everyone just was expected to know, and that way you could compete. Now sometimes some of them got kind of tricky with that thing. And what they would do is they would call tunes that everyone was used to playing, but they'd call them in a weird key, right, to try to throw them off. And apparently that was one of the ways that Charlie Parker got fooled a few times early on in his career before he became more practiced. This music is very riff oriented, both in the melodies and in the backgrounds of the solos. So just like we saw with Fletcher Henderson, you have these characteristic backgrounds to solos, but instead of them being written out the way that they were for Fletcher Henderson, they often used these riffs that were flexible, that people just sort of knew. They were kind of blues cliches, but da 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 is the one that we all know now, right? There's a very typical one, but there were a ton of these things, and you could just use them as backgrounds for solos, more or less on the fly, right? If I'm the saxophone player and I'm playing a solo, then maybe the trumpeter will go behind me and play a little riff over and over again as a background for that solo. Lots of call and response textures, which often happens in the blues anyway, and then kind of a heavier dance rhythm than the New York style. The New York style is, at least at first, a much lighter approach to dance, and the rhythms that support that dance. But in the Midwest, in the territory bands, you have this heavier approach to dance, and this is known as the stomp approach. And indeed, even those stomps would sometimes work into stop time things, which we've heard already with the original Dixieland Jazz Band, but that dump, 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 and then you leave space for the soloist, right? Well, the stomps in the Kansas City style, where you have all four hits, but you're hitting them hard, and you're really creating this forward momentum, and that becomes very popular throughout the country. So the Count Basie Band, of course, becomes one of the most formidable of the Kansas City territory bands, with Lester Young, and that's who you see there on the saxophone, and you can see Count Basie playing piano with a cigarette in his mouth in the front. Lester Young's one of the great soloists, right up there with Louis Armstrong, but a very different style than Louis Armstrong. He tends to use the sixth scale degree a lot in very interesting ways. Lester Young, he does a lot with superposition of chords. So even though you're playing, let's say, a G chord, he will arpeggiate a C7 over that to create kind of a tension, and then resolve the C down to a B. So you remember a C7 would have a B flat, so you get that blue note in there, and then you resolve the C down to the B. That's a typical move of his. He'd like to play chords like as sixth chords, meaning like an F6. So if you're playing an F chord, FAC, instead of putting a seventh on there, he would put the sixth degree, the D, and use that quite a bit. And sometimes he had this little cliche, he used the D flat C, right? 6 flat 6 5. That shows up in a lot of his solos. Listen to 1 O'Clock Jump from 37. That's a fine example of their approach to a head arrangement. A lot of these songs were written as head arrangements, meaning they didn't write them out and they didn't pass them around. They said, okay, well, here's the melody. I want you to do this riff behind this solo and this riff behind that solo, and then you drop out. And so it was, you just sort of set it up among the band and you keep it in your head, right? Thus, head arrangement. And then, of course, one of the solos that a lot of people learning jazz learn by heart, and I've learned it by heart several times because you forget it and then you go back and learn it again, is the Lester Young solo on "Oh Lady Be Good," the Gershwin tune. This is a recording from 1936, and it's an amazing solo, and it has all those characteristics I was talking about. The other thing I didn't mention is his sense of time. His sense of time is so loose and so beautiful, and he pulls back so far behind the beat and then catches up, and there's a part in that solo where he's basically just wailing on this one note with this grace note underneath it, and just listen to the way he manipulates time in that solo of "Oh Lady Be Good." It's one of the highlights of the Kansas City sound. Not surprisingly, John Hammond gets involved, right? He comes out to Kansas City with Joe Glazer, the manager for Louis Armstrong, in 1934. At this point, we're already talking about a burgeoning scene. The scene in Kansas City apparently is amazing already at that point, very high level players, but they're not getting recorded much. And John Hammond comes out and he's going to, he works for Columbia Records, so he's going to change all that. They begin producing several of the acts there, including Basie, and he really makes it a national scene. What was a local scene, he makes it into a national scene. And you can see John Hammond, he's a rich kid. He came from a rich New York family. He doesn't really need... He has a large inheritance. He doesn't really need to work. And so he's doing this really out of a love of music and wanting to be involved in the music industry. And so he's really managing a lot of careers over the course of his life. And you can see here he's still quite young. Now, there are several important and influential white bands of the 20s and 30s that we want to talk about before we move on to the huge ones. So the sweet band contingent, we talked about Paul Whiteman before. The sweet bands became ever more sophisticated over the course of the 20s and into the 30s. Of course, we saw Paul Whiteman, and he began to use Ferd Groffet as his arranger, the composer of the Grand Canyon Suite, right? So a very sophisticated arranger, writing classical music as well as jazz music. And then you have Jean Goldket's Victor Recording Orchestra, and that had Bix Beiderbecke and Frankie Trumbauer, Eddie Lang on guitar, one of the great guitarists, Joe Venuti on violin, and of course Eddie Lang with Joe Venuti, some of the great recordings of that era. And so pretty sophisticated arrangements, pretty special recordings. They're sometimes forgotten now, but Goldket really had his own roster of these incredible performers that probably should have had a longer lasting impact on our historical memory than they seem to have had. And then there's the often forgotten but also very important, Casa Loma Orchestra. They started in 1927 as the Orange Blossoms. They're another Detroit group, just like Goldket, like all of Goldket's groups, and they were under Goldket's guidance at first. The orchestra was a collective, though, so each member was a shareholder, and that's a pretty innovative idea. For the most part, that's not how swing bands work. A few of them work that way, but this idea that everybody's a shareholder in a business enterprise, right? That makes it so everybody has an equal investment. 'Cause, a lot of times, touring is not easy on anybody, and so some band members would become somewhat unreliable on tour. But if you're a stockholder in the group, you might be encouraged to be less unreliable. They started recording for OK Records in 1929, and then Brunswick, and then Casa Loma Stomp was recorded in 1930, and that really becomes a model. If you listen to it, you're going to recognize a lot of the things that come about in the 30s are already there in that recording. It becomes a model for many early swing bands. Henderson re-recorded the song, and all of these recordings, these later recordings, they tried to make it faster and faster. When you hear the original, it's at a fairly slow or at least medium pace. And this is really music, especially as it gets faster and faster, it's music that's really more for listening than dancing per se. And the Casa Loma Orchestra has a very, I think, rich and sophisticated approach to orchestration. It's very different from Henderson, even though Henderson was influenced by it. And Henderson's style gets a bit sweeter after he's influenced by this recording. One of the great virtuosos, a lot of the swing bands had at least one virtuoso instrumentalist in it. You saw that, for instance, Goldket's group had Bix Beiderbecke and Frankie Trumbauer, so they had at least two amazing virtuosic instrumentalists. But a lot of the groups had someone, and a lot of times they were the leader, and that's the case here. Benny Goodman. In 1932, Benny Goodman's already a brilliant studio musician. You can hear it's not from 1932, but you can hear his recordings of classical music. He played some Stravinsky, he played some Mozart, and he's a brilliant player. Just he's got this tone that you recognize immediately, just like Louis Armstrong, right? If you might hear a sort of vault recording, a recording that wasn't widely released that you've never heard before, even if you're a big Benny Goodman fan, or same applies to Louis Armstrong, and I'm a huge fan of both. And you recognize immediately as soon as they play a few notes, just their timbre, their approach to the instrument, very recognizable. But at this time in 1932, he's hardly getting any work really, because first of all, in this part of the Depression, especially prior to 33, there's just not many recordings being made, so it's not a good time to be a studio musician. But then he meets John Hammond. And remember, John Hammond's working with Fletcher Henderson. And John Hammond hears a lot of promise in Benny Goodman because he's an amazing musician. But he's also a very serious businessman, Benny Goodman. And he takes his role as leader very seriously. And so John Hammond begins convincing Fletcher Henderson, who is not a great leader. Fletcher Henderson's a great composer and a great orchestrator, but he's not a great businessman. And he's having trouble keeping his band together. People keep leaving. He doesn't always get paid for gigs, and he doesn't follow it up the way that he should. And so John Hammond says, maybe you need to focus on what you're good at, the orchestration stuff. And he convinces him to sell some orchestrations to Benny Goodman, and Benny Goodman really makes the most out of those things, and they're brilliant orchestrations. In 1934, December, he's on the National Biscuit Company radio show promoting the Ritz cracker, which at this time was a new thing, on a show called Let's Dance, right? And there were three bands, and they were the three types of bands of the swing era. You had the hot band, you had the sweet band, and you had the Latin band, and Goodman was the hot band. So he came on last. He was for the late night crowd, for the young kids, and that's when he was playing, and this is in New York. Then he goes on a tour, and he just has a lousy tour. He's not getting anywhere. And then he starts just playing like the sweet music. He starts off early in the tour playing all of the hot numbers that he wants to make his reputation on, but they're just not going anywhere. So he kind of gives up, and he's playing the sweet music, and he's not enjoying himself. And then in 35, August 21st, he winds up at the Palomar Ballroom in Hollywood, and everyone loves it. Right? And he winds up inspiring other bands. So why is it that they love it? Well, let's talk about that next. He shows up to the Palomar Ballroom, and the difference is that the Palomar Ballroom, you got to remember that what's late at night in New York when it's being nationally broadcast is not late at night in Hollywood. So a lot of these relatively young kids, they know him from the radio show, because they're hearing him before bedtime. They're hearing him during the school nights, and they're hearing him before their required bedtime. He's on just after dinner for them, even though he's on past midnight back home, or I don't know the exact hours, but so they know a lot of the tunes. So he gets up there, he starts playing a bunch of the lighter tunes, the sweet tunes, and the kids are kind of booing. He's like, "Oh, great, another terrible tour." And then the kids start shouting out that they want to hear Sing, Sing, Sing with a Little Swing, and he can't believe what he's hearing, that they want to hear one of the tunes that he wants to play. So then he starts playing all of his big hits, and it's a huge success, and the press is there, and it just really makes his reputation. So in 1937, he records Sing, Sing, Sing with Little Swing. It's a loose but very tight arrangement by Jim Mundy. But the drummer, Gene Krupa, is really who steals the show in some ways. And this is a very aggressive approach to swing drumming. And he introduces an extended improvisation section. So this is a long song. It's 8.5 minutes, so it's two sides of a single. This is one of those songs, and this happened in the 20s and 30s quite a bit, where if you had an extended composition, you'd have to have half of it on one side and half on the other, because at most you can only fit a little over 4 minutes, and some record companies couldn't even get more than 3.5 minutes. So the average song is about 3 to 3.5 minutes, and then the really long compositions, like this one, 8.5 minutes, they'd have to be split. And usually they find either some way to stop the tune halfway through and start up again, or they just sort of cut it when putting it on disc. In 1940, he has Taken a Chance on Love. This is a great example of how singers worked in the swing era. They were not the focus. There were plenty of songs that had lyrics and plenty of singers to sing those lyrics. Helen Forrest was with the Goodman Band in 1940. She's a great example of a female swing singer. And you'll notice that what she does is the orchestra plays the first half chorus, then she enters and sings a full chorus, and then she disappears for the remainder of the song. She doesn't come back for a final chorus. They're just solos for the remainder of the song. So she has a chorus just like any other soloist might have a chorus. If there's a featured soloist, they might get a full chorus to themselves. And that's how singers were treated then. So the singers were not the stars; they were just another person in the band. They would just sit, next to one of the trumpeters or sax players, just like another member of the band. And when it was their turn to sing, they'd stand up, walk over to the microphone, sing their bit, then go back and sit down. They were not the stars of the show, and we will soon see how all that changes. Another important thing about Benny Goodman is he was one of the first, and probably actually the first, to really have a lot of mixed groups that he played with. So he had Teddy Wilson, the pianist that you see there. Teddy Wilson not only played in these smaller groups that he put together, but also in the big group. And that was a real moment of integration within music, because these swing bands that we're talking about now, the white bands, were really white. They were meant for really largely white audiences, and they were representational of a kind of whiteness, with everything that implies in the 30s and 40s, a very highly segregated time for the country. Really, everything from Jim Crow from the late 19th century through the 1960s is a highly segregated moment, obviously in the U.S. So the fact that Goodman is playing with so many really outstanding black musicians is something that stands out, because it's not something that's happening a lot, even later, even in the decades following Goodman. So he's playing in two groups. He's got his large orchestra, and Teddy Wilson, by the way, he's in both groups. So Teddy Wilson's playing with the large group. The rest of the performers are white. And then Benny Goodman also has this smaller group, and the smaller group has Gene Krupa, the white drummer, and of course Benny Goodman on clarinet, the white band leader and clarinetist. But then Teddy Wilson on piano. Sometimes they had a bass player, and I can't remember who it was. But then Charlie Christian on electric guitar, one of the first instances of electric guitar in jazz, and then Lionel Hampton on vibraphone. So this mostly black group, and they're amazing. Check out these recordings, and you can hear Benny Goodman can keep up with these people, and with everybody that's in the group, and they can keep up with him, and the whole group is a real unit. It's really at least four soloists that we're talking about, not just backing members of a group like the larger group for Benny Goodman. And they have a lot of up-tempo tunes, a lot of tunes that the larger group probably couldn't really manage to play. Charlie Christian's guitar playing, of course, is highly influential. His way of approaching long runs, his way of dealing like Lester Young with sixth chords, and he's coming out of that tradition of Kansas City as well, and so he has some of those same sensibilities that Lester Young had, but a very individual sound, of course. And of course, there would be no swing music really without the dancing and without the style. And here you can see several pictures of both black and white dance audiences. You can see the black audience there waiting to get into the Savoy. You can see another black couple in the fashion of the 30s there dancing in the middle of a dance. You can see another picture. I love that picture at the top of the Savoy. Then you see some white swing dancers, and you can see the athleticism of it. You see how low they are staying toward the ground, right? This is a much more flexible form of dancing. The hips are swinging more. It's less formal in some ways, although there's plenty of obvious skill that you have to learn, and there are sort of routines to it, things that one does as a swing dancer. But it's meant to seem more improvisational and looser. The Savoy Ballroom was on Lenox Avenue in Harlem for a long time, and you had the Cat's Corner within that, where the really great dancers would dance and compete for each other and so on. You had these dances like the Lindy Hop, lower to the floor, less erect, with these breakaways. And breakaways are moments where a single dancer or maybe two dancers would be the focus. Everyone would sort of stop and create a circle and pay attention to them. And that's more or less what you're seeing in the lower picture is at least the beginning of a breakaway where this one couple is going to be the focus for a moment. You also have the rise of the jazz fanatic, and these were usually a white audience member. And really, a lot of the jazz groups are appealing. The swing groups are appealing to white audiences more than earlier jazz had. And when I say that, I mean both white bands and black bands are starting to appeal to white audiences. So this is more of a crossover effect than we've seen for a lot of music prior to this. And especially with jazz in the 30s and early 40s, it was especially young white males. And this is the rise of a fanatic where people they would collect these records. They would know all the soloists and band members on a given record. And remember, when we're talking about records, we're not talking about albums. We're talking about singles. And so you would have a massive collection of these things where you basically have a disc with two songs, and sometimes a disc with one song where two parts of the song were on different sides. And so people would really be very interested in these players in the same way that sometimes young men are interested in baseball players, and they know you know the baseball player statistics, and you know what teams they've been in. And here you would know the soloists, you would know what their best recordings were and what groups they've been in, and so on. So several of these fanatics, and that's the reason they're called fanatics is for this reason. They were extremely knowledgeable about performer histories and recordings and etc. And so they treated music more or less like they were sports, right? So sports teams. So you have the teams and the statistics, the bands and the recordings and the interviews and the how high can this trumpet player get on his instrument versus this one and that kind of thing. Of course, you had several important groups and players. Ellington makes the transition very well into the swing era with what is sometimes called the Blanton Webster group. And that's because Jimmy Blanton's on the bass, one of the innovators of the bass. And you have Ben Webster on the saxophone, brilliant player, very characteristic sound for the saxophone at that time. You got Coleman Hawkins on tenor sax, and he was with Henderson, but then he leaves for Europe, and we'll talk about him coming back because he comes back just in time for the swing era to basically die on him. You have Lester Young, the great tenor saxophone player with Count Basie. Cab Calloway, a huge star of the swing era. He's the one that replaces Ellington at the Cotton Club when Ellington starts going on all of his tours in the 30s. You have in Chicago Andy Kirk's 12 Clouds of Joy, and that group has Mary Lou Williams on the piano, brilliant composer and performer. And then you have Benny Moten, who's the predecessor to Count Basie. So these are some of the important groups and players of the swing era. Now, one of the very successful groups of this era is Glenn Miller. He releases the song "In the Mood" in 1930. You have groups like led by these people. Glenn Miller, he's not quite a virtuoso in the way that Benny Goodman was, or Artie Shaw, or the Dorsey brothers, right? And it's not because the trombone doesn't have virtuosity available to it. One of the Dorsey brothers is a trombonist, and he's quite virtuosic. But Glenn Miller's more of a smooth sound, and he's got a beautiful tone. Don't get me wrong, but he can't play fast things very well. He's all these other bands, they were a combination. They were somewhere in the middle of sweet and hot. And for the most part, the Glenn Miller band, not too much hot music, some up-tempo things, but for the most part, not. These bands were very professional, but not always very remarkable. And Glenn Miller's a good example of that. They had plenty of sweet numbers alongside some bouncier, more danceable numbers. Miller's band was the best-selling group from 1939 to 1942. So 3 years where they're the best-selling group in the nation, with 16 number ones and 69 top 10 hits, and that's more than Elvis or the Beatles, right? So incredibly successful, like Paul Whiteman before him. And like Paul Whiteman before him, he's, successful by being a little bland. Don't get me wrong. these recordings are great, and I love them, but they're not exciting. They're not like Artie Shaw can be, and they're certainly not like Benny Goodman was. And so that made, in a way, his music oddly controversial in its kind of response to controversy, because you have many critics and commentators that felt that swing was too erratic, too emotional, and lacking sophistication. Well, Miller had sophistication, and he had this beautifully polished sound, but that made the swing fans feel like he was lacking in verve and excitement. So in a way, he couldn't win, because the people who complained about jazz and weren't that interested in jazz, he sounded the way that they might have wanted him to sound, but they weren't terribly interested in jazz. The people who were interested in jazz didn't like that commercial sound. And yet, don't make any mistake here. He had a wide commercial appeal. He did very well, especially like we just saw in the end of the 30s and the early 40s, the run up to the U.S. participation in World War One or World War Two. I mean. And Glenn Miller dies in World War II in a plane crash. So In the Mood's an excellent demonstration of this very strict, very smooth sound that he produces. And that would be the one to listen to for a sense of his style and his approach. And just listen to how marketable it is, right? It's not terribly remarkable. Nothing in there stands out. Nothing in there says, oh, wow, that was a great solo. There aren't any really great solos in Glenn Miller's recordings, I don't think. And yet there's nothing that's bad in any of them either. They're very digestible. They're very listenable. That's it for this session.